This is Show Up as a Leader, a show from People Forward Network, helping you maximize your positive impact on the world by becoming your best, fully authentic self. Hey, everyone. I'm just going to forewarn you that you're going to probably need to listen to this conversation more than once and possibly have pen and paper handy, because there are so many times where there are rich nuggets and goodies that you're going to want to capture. I guarantee it. I loved my conversation with John Robertson. He's inspired and driven by his values, and he is a facilitator, coach, and guide for clients where he really helps them test and discover and expand what they can do. He is such a rich source of wisdom, and he is the founder and president of a company called FORTLOG Systems. And we talk about this combination of living in this VUCA world along with FOMO, or fear of missing out. We talk about redefining crises and what that does to us. We talk about this idea of we need to run towards the roar. We really talk about this need to define what we are actually for rather than what we're against. He talks about what we can actually learn from smokers that can help us be better and more effective in our life. And we have a really rich conversation around what it means to finish well. Again, so many awesome nuggets in this conversation that I hope you take away for yourself and apply in your life. All right, John, I am really excited to have this conversation with you. I know this is going to be a fantastic jam session. So I just want to jump right in, because one of the stats that I've been using lately in my workshops and speaking engagements is a stat from the American Psychological Association that 87% of adults feel that there has been a constant stream of crises since 2020 without any kind of break. And it's taking its toll on our stress, on our well-being. The list goes on and on. And so I want to jump off there, because we call this our VUCA world, VUCA extreme. It's not getting any less disruptive. The crises aren't ending anytime soon. So talk about how we handle and show up in the face of nonstop crises.
So two things with the American Psychological Association. And by the way, they're not looking for my agreement or not. But one of the things that happens is we have reshaped or redefined, reformatted what crises actually means. And in a VUCA world, combined with FOMO, that fear of missing out, has created a sense of urgency that comes across as a crisis. And there is an old expression, a lack of planning on your part does not create a crisis on my part. And so what's starting to happen is mid-senior leaders, persons in leadership, are constantly feeling like they're on one of those old turntables. And the only thing that's changing is the spin of the turntable. So two things have to be addressed. Number one, go back to those old schoolyard things. They're now illegal because they're dangerous. But it was that turntable that we used to spin on, and the goal was to spin the person off. One of the things that happens in those is, in order to thrive when things are spinning, you got to get to the center. Get off is ideal. Majority are not able to step out of leadership. And to thrive as a leader during a VUCA FOMO society culture, you got to get to the center. Around what am I pivoting? What are my real values? Not the ones posted on some website or some that people talk about, but the ones that show up in our daytimer and in our calendar. And one of the things that's happening right now is the last 3 years, and I know some people say that COVID is over, the pandemic is over. Maybe the virus part of the pandemic, but it created a tsunami of effect that is just starting to ripple, because people's values going into that storm are not the values coming out of it. Let me illustrate this. My wife was just talking with a woman the other day at her work. My wife works in a school office, and this woman is just one of those gifted teachers that you want your kid to have. And this woman came to her and said, "So, Carolyn, how far are you from retirement?" And Carolyn's doing well, I don't know if I'm going to make it till I fully get to retire. And this woman's comment was, I am so done with all of this stuff. I am going to take a pay cut and retire early. Are you going to be here till December? And what's starting to happen in this crisis leadership, we must clarify what are those core values. We're not getting out of it alive. But if we don't clarify, the battery starts to get drained by always being on. And it's not a psychiatric, psychological, or mental health issue. It's a battery issue. I just don't have enough charge left in my battery for physical, for emotional, for relational, all of those things that actually charge our batteries.
I love that. When you think about the battery, the visual that popped in my head was years ago, Tom Rath wrote a book, Are You Fully Charged? And used this analogy of the battery, right, and our capacity. And what are we doing to help us be fully charged to deal with the knowns and unknowns that the world throws at us? And so I think there's a lot of merit to that because we have a finite amount of energy in the day and capacity. And when you look at, I think it was Gartner HR, that we basically only have the capacity to absorb half the change we could in 2019. So you put all this stuff together, people are depleted, and it's how do we help them move through it? Like you said, find their center, get grounded. We use the analogy of a lighthouse where the lighthouse cuts through the fog and helps ground us. So if we have our core values and our purpose and our organizations and help people, that's what grounds you when you have to deal with the knowns and unknowns that this world throws at you. So I think that there's a lot of merit to that. So you talk about how values coming into COVID, how do people reground themselves or refine that center then?
I am not telling anybody to take up smoking. However, there are 3 things that smokers do that we have to start doing. Number 1, they're doing deep breathing. And I'm not getting into what they're breathing in. They're doing deep breathing exercises. Number 2, they are taking a break. I would rather have a lobotomy without anesthetic than do a jigsaw puzzle. But anybody who's ever done a jigsaw puzzle has said, when you get stuck, you must walk away, take a break, and then come back to it. And the third thing a smoker does is they're outside with social support. And if that is good enough for me to inhale all that stuff, why aren't we taking that exact same ethos to our mental well-being, our emotional well-being, our relational well-being? And how do we do that? First of all, unplugging from work does not recharge us. That's the same thinking that says a cell phone on airplane mode will recharge your cell phone. Not an option. So when we are taking a break, are those people we're outside with our social support? The hardest thing to say to another human being is no. But in order to say no to them, we have to be willing to say yes to ourselves. I can illustrate this in a perfect example. So basically, the CAO or CEO, and there's 4 or 5 directors, and we got chatting about this very principle. And because she's doing planning and development and a bunch of other things, in her role, she's available, and she lives in a smaller city town, so they bump into her. So she's always on duty. So we got chatting about this, and I said, bottom line, Laura, let me just peel the Band-Aid off. What do you do to recharge, not disconnect from work? She said, well, that's simple. I grab my dog and I go for a walk in the bush. She said, we have 100 acres where we live. I said, okay, when did you last do that? And then the excuses started. I said, I want you to feel a slap in the back of the head, because if you're not doing that for you, how can you possibly encourage me to do it for me? And everybody's battery starts getting cooked. And I said to her, Laura, I'm going to quote a really high IQ model from childhood. Monkey see? And she started to laugh, and she ended up taking 2 additional days off work. And both days was in her, and she texted me just to say, by the way, here's the times I'm going through the bush with my dog. One of the things that happens in leadership is, who is your community? At the end of the day, it's just a huddle like football where you put your head and heart together with a few core people so that they can hold you accountable, but more importantly, they can encourage you to honor your values so that when you get back out to play your game, you've got something in the battery.
I love that you talked about this being in community because we do work with leaders and teams, and there's a few exercises. We do one that's like, what are the ingredients to be your best? Who are you when you're at your best? What are some of those? So it might be in this Laura's case, a walk in the bush with her dog. If you keep that to yourself and you don't share that with your team, how can you support one another and in a loving way, not a shaming parental way, hold one another accountable? Because we all want each other to show up as our best. We do an exercise where we do help people identify their values. And then more specifically, what are those behavioral guideposts? What behaviors tell you're in alignment? What behaviors tell you're out of alignment? And then what are like the early warning signs you're getting pulled out of alignment? And so with my team, we have a code, self-care. I will take on too much. I will overschedule. I'll neglect the stuff. And so their code, if they start to see me getting task focused, if they start to see me getting really intense or overwhelmed, or they look at my calendar, they will say, Rosie, when's your next pedicure? And that's code for thank you for the reminder, right? Because I like humor. And so point being is it's great to do those exercises for ourselves to get grounded, but we all get in our own way. And so I love that because if we don't share that and have a dialogue with people and then agreed upon commitments of how do you want someone to help you get back to your center when you get pulled out of alignment and don't see it? Maybe someone likes humor. Maybe someone else just wants you to check in. So we do that with teams. So I love that you brought that up because I think some people listen, you're like, oh yeah, I know my values, or yeah, I know what I need to be my best. How do you rally support when you don't see it for yourself? Because we're not always clear when we're looking at ourselves. We're not always looking in the mirror, especially if we're going 40 million miles an hour on that spinning machine.
I love using personal examples. And one of the personal examples I use for that community, I call it a very huddle because values encouraged allow us to be responsible. So we take the initiative. And that requires what I've coined encourageability, because encouragement is required for accountability. Holding me accountable is just poor parenting. But it goes back to Mike, and he was a funeral home director, and he made the comment to me one day, speaking about the size of a huddle, size of your community. Mike's comment was, don't ever forget, John, all a guy needs is 6 close personal friends. And I didn't get it right away. I said, I'm sorry, Mike, 6 close friends? And he said, John, if you're going cremation, you only need 1. I've never forgotten it because I can now say to people, okay, who are your 6? Since none of us are getting out of this alive, we have to, as leaders, number 1, define what it means to finish well. But second, who are the people going to encourage and accountable so that you do finish well?
There is an exercise that we use in the Dare to Lead curriculum that is really powerful, but it's very similar to that. We call it the square squad. And we ask people on a piece of paper, literally draw a 1-inch by 1-inch square. So it's not very big. And in that, write the initials of the people who know you, who have your back, whose opinions matter, which it probably comes to about 6. And we call it your square squad and say, we're spending so much energy outside of that square, hustling for our worth and trying to win the approval and likes of people who actually don't matter. And we end up steamrolling over or ignoring or neglecting the people who actually do. And so it's very congruent. And it's funny because we were going through a bunch of personal BS in our social network last year. And I just got really clear about who's in my square squad. And when stuff would come up and I'm like, who the hell cares, right? And it was actually a way to talk about getting you back to center, but it was a way of getting regrounded of why do I care about this? Those people aren't in my square squad. So let it go.
One of the big challenges of leadership today is the whole shaming ethos because facts don't matter. In the Old West, it was called a lynch mob. They're tried, convicted, and lynched regardless of any facts. And in leadership, we have to be willing to build that huddle, that community, that team, your square squad, your 6, so that when you need to take a stand for your values, not against, at least 6 will have your back. And to be blunt for the others, just remind them, you have obviously mistaken me for somebody who cares about what you think, and not to be said out loud.
The inside voice doesn't necessarily have to come to the outside.
Absolutely. But that's where that community, that huddle is so strategic because I can use my inside voice in that context and they'll laugh or they'll harass me. Okay, it's time to grow a backbone. What do you want to do about it?
And I think, the people that are in our huddle, that are in our six, in our squad, whatever you want to use, I will say that I'm really thankful for those people in my life because they lovingly call me on my crap. When I'm playing it small, when I'm getting in my own way, they help me get to my center. And it's not in a shaming way. It's not in a blaming way. And I think we all need to have those people in our lives, but we also have to be willing to take off our shields and our masks and our armor to be able to have those people and to be able to say, hey, these are the sides of me that I don't really like, but I know they show up. So here's what I would like from you, or how can you help me get back to me if you notice it and I don't? And I think so many people are not having those conversations because of impression management. We want to put our best foot forward. And even with the people we care about, somehow like we think we're fooling them. We're not.
That's the premise behind what was called the Johari's window, because it speaks to my vulnerability, sharing what you don't know so that I can actually get to my potential. But the second part of that is to be intentional about those people we have in our lives. Number one, most leaders don't have a written definition of what it means to finish well. When I talk about finishing well, many people default to physical. That's not finishing well. I'm talking relationally, emotionally, spiritually, psychologically, and morally. What does it mean to finish well in all areas of my life? But the second part of that is once I have a definition or you have a definition of finishing well, then we need that person more mature than us, but somebody that when I grow up, I want to be like, somebody less mature, somebody that we're investing in because they're like a teenager. They're going to call us on stuff to say, okay, John, you said, but what I'm seeing, what am I missing? And then we need that third person who we're not being mentored by or we're not mentoring. They're just on the side observing what they're seeing or not seeing. They care enough to ask us to say, okay, I'm seeing a penalty here. What's going on?
I love it gives parameters of, do you have these types of people in your huddle, in your squad? And if not, how can you start to nurture some relationships so that you have all vantage points, right? Not just people who tell you what you want to hear, but people who tell you what you need to hear.
And I'm going to be completely transparent with your listeners and you. I'm a natural coward when it comes to conflict. I'm one of those people that's very comfortable hiding underneath the bed until the storm passes. Conflict resolution, constructive, is a learned behavior for me. I have 3 kids, a son-in-law, and 1 wife who put me under the bed more than once. And one of the things I love about them is they call me on it. And it's like, okay, Dad, man up. There's a way that a family calls us on our stuff that while they use our hand to slap us, we want to say thank you to them.
Speaking of coming out from under the bed, one of the things that you talk about that I think is so appropriate is this idea of running towards the roar. Can you explain what that is and why we need to run towards the roar?
One of the things, and this is exactly that crisis reaction mode. Keep in mind, crisis has 4 elements to its definition, and I'm getting to the run toward the roar. A typical crisis is sudden, unexpected, threat to our goals, and that kind of thing. But it's that 4th one. It's the one that we're dealing with now. And that is crisis is that point where change is required. It's no longer optional, and it's not a crisis. That 4th definition of crisis where change is required is where we as humans have to be willing to give our brain permission to stop reacting, which is the fight, flight, freeze, appease buttons every human being has. When you and I define what we are for, the term I use is passio fidelis. Passio is the root word of passion, that fire in the bones, our values, what motivates us, those kinds of activities, spiritually, emotionally, psychologically, so forth. And fidelis is the root word of fidelity, of faithfulness, of loyalty. U.S. Marines have the term semper fidelis, semper fi, which means always faithful, always loyal. Passio fidelis is that passionate faithfulness that I will press on through this storm. So when life gives us a Charlie horse, and Rosie, I'm not trying to do a squirrel on you. Have you ever had a physical Charlie horse? We're still doing the same thing as leaders. Life gives us Charlie horse, psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, morally, relationally. If you define what your passio fidelis is, what you are passionately going to be faithful to, we will find a way to get back in the game. If we get a Charlie horse doing something we are not passio fidelis, any injury takes us out of the game. So therefore, in order to run toward the roar, we have to define our passio fidelis so that when we get the Charlie horses, humans can override that normal instinct of fight, flight, freeze, appease, and get back in the game and run toward the roar.
I love that on so many levels. And I think you're right. And I think going back to so many people, I'm amazed. I've done this exercise a lot lately with teams, and people are like, this is hard. I haven't thought about my values, or I haven't gone a further step to go, oh, that word sounds nice, but not who I think I should be, but who I actually am. And I had someone who was fighting, like we had to have this whole discussion because there was a lot of shame around, but this is me. I'm like, why is that shameful? Let's talk about what's a healthy expression of that value and what is an unhealthy expression. So maybe that's a better way, right? Like in alignment, out of alignment, healthy expression, unhealthy. There's nothing wrong with that being your value, but can you see a difference of when it serves you well and when it doesn't? And I think when we take that extra step and we get clear, it helps us because not only, hey, I stand for this, this matters to me, but also this is how I need to show up for that to happen. And I think that operationalization of those values of that center gets missed. And I think that's what helps get people off to that center and the swirl.
And that's exactly when I'm doing this kind of thing with groups or leadership. A value has to have a definition. And it doesn't matter whether Webster's or any other dictionary agrees with it. I have to teach you what my definition is of that value. The third piece, which you just perfectly described, is the piece that most people forget. What are the behaviors associated with that definition of that value? And I use the example of integrity. Integrity actually has a definition that means my morals and my behaviors are in agreement. They're aligned. So I've never met anybody who says, oh, I don't have any integrity. On the other hand, I have worked with people that I know do not share the same definition. And I challenge people to move away from that because, let me illustrate. So Rosie, you and I work together and you hear me saying to a colleague, I don't have a problem not telling the truth to a client, to a customer. It's not a big deal for me. I'm not going to say I'm lying. I'm just not telling the whole truth. That's not a problem for me. And then you see me with a customer and I am not telling them the truth. I don't have a problem doing that. And you see my behavior doing it. I actually have integrity. I just really encourage your listeners and the people that you serve. It's those behaviors. It's the operationalization of those values that matter, not the title of the value, because the definition must be described in behaviors. And that's the stuff we can encourage people with.
Absolutely. And I think if we take that a step further and take it off the individual level to the organizational, because how often I will work with an organization and first of all, one of their values is integrity. And Pat Lencioni will say, nope, that's not a core value. Or they'll have respect. And I'm like, you know what? If you don't define in this organization what we mean by respect, every single person here can have a different definition. And that's problematic. And so it's not about getting into like Stepford-wise dictatorship. It's this is how we believe and what makes us tick in this organization. And you can either opt in and say, hey, I want to be a part of this, or you can opt out and say, not for me. But if that's not defined, you might go in thinking, ooh, I agree with their core values. And then you find out, no, they define them very differently. And this isn't a place for me. I think that we have to do that at a group level. And I think that gets missed so much too.
And that's why for me, it's a chicken and the egg. I've done this with some organizations and then they get mad at me when we walk through the behaviors and they blow off a meeting with me. And I say, so just curious, one of your core values is respectful. How do I interpret you blowing off a meeting with me as being respectful. What am I missing? That's the key of running toward the roar. That's the key in finishing well, because there's not going to be a lineup of people at my funeral. But to quote you, I want those people in my boxes. I want them there for something other than the will, which isn't going to be worth being there for.
It's funny because I don't always give this out, but where it feels appropriate, I've had some of my clients where I do give them the assignment to write their eulogy and think about, like you were talking about, how do I want people to feel about me from a community member or from work or relationships or whatever. And for so many people, it's really hard for them. And for some, it's really insightful. But then that's where we get back to, okay, well, how does that help anchor? Like, what do you need? Where are you not in alignment with your center or your values? What do you need to let go of? You got to say no to something. Like you said, you got to say no to others so you can say yes to yourself. And so I think that's such an unsettling way to look at it for some people. But for some, it can be really enlightening and kind of give that roar, if you will, that helps them run towards it because they just haven't really thought about it. They've just been busy being a human doing rather than a human being.
And for me, that's that whole premise behind that leadership ethos. It's the I am in an I have culture.
Say that again and say more about this because I think this is such a critical shift that we need to be talking about.
100%. And it's I am in an I have culture. And in an I have culture, FOMO and all those other things become really vital. I have a number of followers on LinkedIn, on whatever post platform. I have a bachelor's or a master's degree. I have a house in XYZ location. I have this title. And when we talk about the Latin word of authority is actually auctoritas, auctoritas. And auctoritas is the kind of authority when a person walks into the room, people notice it, if you will. There is a composure, a credibility, a countenance, chemistry, all of those factors rolled into one bundle. And marketing is using this today because auctoritas, one of its words of definition is called character, what we are in the dark, not the mask. Character gets its origin from the root word of brand. And what do marketing people talk about all the time? What's your brand? Leadership is actually our character that gives us the authority, which becomes our brand, the I am. I can personally guarantee you that when this person, when he or she walks into the room, you will stop talking about something that is transparent, authentic, vulnerable, because you cannot turn your back on them.
I love what you're saying there because there are the people who enter the room and people shut down because it's not safe. And they're also the people who brighten the room when they leave.
And a line we heard from a guy years and years ago, he said, well, what my wife and I do when we get to that point with people is I look at her and say, sweetheart, why don't we go to bed so these nice people can go home? And what happens with community, with our huddle, if you and I are not intentionally building it with people who walk into the room and people open up, then our room will be filled with people. When they walk in, people shut down. That is the core of the term I use for leadership, persona auctoritas. And persona is the Latin word used for the old Roman theater where the actors would hold a mask on a stick in front of their face to portray the character that they want the audience to see. For me, it's the perfect description of leadership. Have we got a mask on in front of us, but our auctoritas, our brand, our character is relaying a message? Do people open up or shut down? And I am in an I have culture, and crisis has become the catalyst where people are dying for I am leadership.
Oh, 100%. I think going back to this I have world, it is so filtered. People post the persona version of themselves on social media. They're even like using filters to tweak their lips and their face. And then people believe it's a reality. I know there's this whole thing about how dangerous it is for kids because their brains are still developing, et cetera. But I think we go a step further is I think there is so much filteredness And there's a cancel culture and there's just all of this stuff in our I have world that people don't know what's at their core. They maybe don't even know what their character is. I was just talking about this yesterday, but the Taylor Swift song Antihero, she says, I'll stare directly at the sun, but never in the mirror. There's a lot of unsettledness that people don't want to look in the mirror because who am I? And then that's what if it's not enough or et cetera. And I think there's such a lacking of transparency and such a lacking of authenticity of people being willing to say, no, this is me. At the same time, there's more and more people that are trying to blow the lid off of it. So I think that people want realness and authenticity over polish and perfection any day of the week. But we have to remind ourselves of that and say, I'm going to take that mask and move it away from my face and like, hey, this is me, scars and all. And that's what actually connects us with others. The things we're most afraid to show are actually the things that connect us the most to other people.
And that's the upside of crisis. So in my speaking and that kind of work that I do, I get people thinking about the thinking, because the upside of crisis is we lose the margin for dealing with foolishness. And that's the upside of crisis. But if I don't know what's of value to me, how does one evaluate when we don't know what's important? And as a result, I'm caught always reacting, never responding, never running toward the roar. And the joy that it creates when you do something that we value allows us to thrive regardless of the storm that's going on around us. And there's a book written years and years ago. I don't even know if it's still available, by Dr. John Powell or Howell. And it's Why Am I Afraid to Tell You Who I Am? And the book walks through the levels of communication. So shallow is cliche. I can have that with all kinds of people. The next level is fact, sharing what I know, and then feeling, sharing what I feel. Fewer people are interested, but it tells you more about me. The lowest level for him, the deepest level of conversation, communication, is transparency, sharing who I am. Very few care, but it leaves very little hidden. What's happening in an I have culture, people are so busy running around trying to show, prove, demonstrate, whatever the term is, that we're actually losing ourselves. And workplaces, relationships pay the price.
I think you're spot on. And when we get disconnected from who we are, we don't know who we are anymore, we are caught in that swirl. And I think, how hard is it to be connected to someone when they're wearing a mask in front of their face? And what I always talk about in the work I do is the more VUCA and FOMO our world gets, or the more disruptive our world gets, the more it almost triggers us to put those masks on and to hide. And now you put a bunch of us together in a workplace, a team, a community, and you wonder why we have the defensiveness, we have the disconnection, we have the loneliness epidemic, we have the mental health challenges. What I love about how you put this is if we can just think about self-care, if we then don't actually schedule and nurture time to get clear about who we are and tend to that, we're going to get pulled away from that and those masks are going to come back on again.
And Rosie, because one of my values is family, one of the things that I'm going to really challenge, if you do not keep a charge in your battery, when the person you say you love needs a boost, you will not have enough charge in your battery to actually boost their battery. Please don't tell me you love somebody if you don't have enough charge in your battery to boost them when their battery gets low.
Taking care of ourselves and boosting our battery or charging our battery is not an act of selfishness. It's an act of selflessness and love for others.
And it manifests, those behaviors you and I were chatting about, it manifests in our behaviors to the ones that are in our box, in our huddle, in our community. I'm going to just share in a personal example. We have a cottage that's accessible by boat. So we're coming across the lake. So my wife, I'm driving, two boys sitting behind me. Long story short, they asked me a question, but they carried on the conversation without me answering. And Chris, one of our sons, asked a question a little bit later and I didn't answer. And he asked another question I didn't answer. And Chris turns to mom and says, "What's the matter with him?" My wife throws me under the bus and she says, "Oh, when he gets his feelings hurt, he gets this little pout on and he goes quiet like he doesn't hear us. He'll come back in a little while." As we neared the dock where we parked the vehicle and trailer for the boat, My son leans forward, taps me on the shoulder, and he says, "Hey, Dad, give me the truck keys. I'll go get the truck and the trailer while you're busy sorting yourself out." And the four of us busted out laughing in the boat. It was one of those, "Okay, John, you just got called out."
I love people who do that for us. That is fantastic.
It was so perfect because as we're getting out of the boat, all of us are dying laughing. So for the next little while, "So, Dad, how's the sorting going?"
I'm so appreciating this conversation, and I want to build on this with where I go with all my guests. So speaking of the mask and taking that mask off, one of the things that I've learned is not only do we all wear masks, but we're wearing them to hide that part of ourselves that we are insecure about, that we feel less than, whatever the heck it is. And so I know that we all have these self-limiting stories that no matter how much work we've done on ourselves, creep up from time to time. And so what I would love, if you're willing to share, John, is what is a self-limiting story that you still tell yourself sometimes? And when it shows up, how do you move beyond it? How do you remove that mask, so to speak, so that you can still show up as a leader in your life and honor your center?
One of the self-limiting things is if you can't do it perfectly, don't do it. So a bunch of life lessons have contributed to, if it's not done perfectly, you're going to get criticized. Eeyore and Winnie the Pooh characters and get down on myself and nothing's working and woe is me. Anyways, last weekend, it was my wife who actually called me out on it. And I said, I think it's just best for me to raise the white flag. And she smiled and she said, "Probably not going to be the last time you raise the white flag, but I know it's not the first time." And she said, when you get to the point of all these things going on in your life and they're all converging and every single thing that you thought would work out differently, nothing seems to be working out. You get so down on yourself and you throw in the towel. You do that to yourself. If it's not perfect, you're a loser. And she went on with this rant. But she enlightened me with the observation, and then she does the resounding slap across the back of the head verbally. She says, "Do you want to be an adult and try adulting and do something about it? Or do you want to remain in the current age group you find yourself in?" While she is using my hand to slap me across the face, I'm thinking, wow, did that mask get pulled down? Now, just as a desired outcome, we did immediately implement a couple changes. And instead of focusing on the things that weren't working, she actually said, "So what's one thing you've got going for you?" It's those people in our lives. And I have a friend that we don't get together like every week. But when we get together, we grab our coffee. He and I get right down to, "So John, what are you doing?" And we get right down to those values and talking about the stuff that's killing his battery, talking about the things that he's doing to charge it, because he has 2 kids. He just had his first grandchild and the second one's on the way. Part of this story was, I really wish Grandma was here for this. What has that got to do with business? Everything.
I love that you're modeling, like when you get in your own way, you have people in your life, right? You go to the square squad, you go to the 6. That's awesome. All right, John, are you ready for quick questions? Fill in the blank. Living authentically is?
Passio Fidelis.
Love it. When the world is presenting an opening, but you don't feel like showing up as a leader, what do you do?
If this is part of where I can add value, suck it up and step into it.
Nice. What is something people would be surprised to know about you?
Well, one is I sucked my thumb till I was 17.
No way. And your teeth are fine. So, hey, there we go.
And no braces, by the way.
All right. What is your favorite go-to movie?
It's a real toss-up between Bruce Willis, the Die Hard series, and the Fallen series. So Olympus, London, I think it's Angel is the third one.
All right. We got some action going on. I like it. What's your go-to song?
There are so many of them. And for me, it depends on the season.
What's the one right now?
What If? I can't even remember the name of the group, but I just shared it with 3 people I'm coaching. And they were talking about if only and what if. And I reminded them, don't forget, life has an if in the middle of it.
I love that. I'm going to have to go listen to it. What is something you can't live without?
My family.
What is something in your ordinary daily life that makes your heart happy?
When I get to do something for my wife or kids, even when it's inconvenient.
And what are you grateful for right now?
I am probably one of the wealthiest people in the world. I have a home, a loving wife, or wife who loves me. I have 3 kids and a son-in-law and 2 grandchildren, and it's nothing to do with have. We get to be with each other, and they are as night and day different from one another, and they get together without us organizing it, and so blessed.
That's awesome. Closing question. John, if you could challenge leaders everywhere to practice this one behavior that would create more human workplaces and equip everyone to show up as a leader, what would that be?
Do your smoke break and say, if I was to take the mask down, how do I want people to describe me non-physically?
I love that. There is so much richness and wisdom in what you do, and I've so appreciated this conversation. Thank you. I'm going to have to go back and listen and take notes. There was a lot of goodness. So just thank you. I'm very appreciative of our time together.
It's my honor because this is the theme that leaders need to be encouraged. We don't need more critics in the stands. We need people just to encourage it. And so I'm very grateful because of the work you're doing. So thank you.
I'm Rosie Ward, and this is Show Up as a Leader. To learn more, head over to peopleforwardnetwork.com and, of course, hit that follow button.